The fluorescent lights hum softly in the small-town police station, casting a sterile glow over the rows of desks and cluttered paperwork. The walls, adorned with old police commendations and faded posters about public safety, give off an air of authority, yet beneath the surface, something else lingers. This isn't just a place of law and order. It's a place of silent judgments, where some officers view their badges as a license for unchecked power rather than a duty to serve and protect. In this environment, racism is never openly acknowledged, yet it thrives in hushed conversations, in the way certain officers sneer at those who don't look like them, and in how some people are treated as less than human. Officer Mike Callahan sits at his desk, legs kicked up, sipping coffee with a smirk on his face. He's been with the force for over a decade, and in his mind, that entitles him to a certain level of respect. His reputation? A cop who does things the old-fashioned way. He talks down to civilians, especially minorities, and sees himself as untouchable. In the corner, David Carter mops the floor with steady, practiced motions. The janitor of the station, David is a quiet man in his mid-50s, wearing an old blue uniform that, despite years of wear, is always neat. He carries himself with an air of quiet dignity, never engaging in small talk unless necessary. While the officers ignore him, he sees everything. Every smirk. Every sideways glance. Every snide comment thrown his way. David Carter moves the mop across the floor with slow, deliberate strokes, his posture relaxed yet efficient. The worn-out blue uniform he wears has seen better days, but it is always clean, pressed, and well-kept, a reflection of the man himself. His salt and pepper hair is cropped short, and his dark brown eyes hold a quiet intensity that few ever take the time to notice. To most, he is invisible. The officers at the station barely spare him a glance as they walk past, chatting about cases, cracking jokes, or complaining about paperwork. To them, David is just the janitor, a background fixture, someone whose presence is acknowledged only when the floors need cleaning or when the trash bins overflow. But David sees everything. He notices the way Officer Mike Callahan, loud, arrogant, and full of himself, leans back in his chair, feet propped up on his desk, smirking as he shares a crude joke. He catches the way the younger officers chuckle at Callahan's remarks, some with genuine amusement, others with an uncomfortable hesitation, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. He hears the murmurs, the dismissive tones, the subtle condescension in their voices whenever they talk about people like him. Must be nice to have a job where all you do is push a mop around. Bet he never finished high school. Guy probably makes minimum wage, if that. David doesn't react. He never does. Instead, he keeps working, his mop gliding across the tile floor as if the words don't touch him. He moves with the same quiet efficiency, never breaking his rhythm, never acknowledging the sneers or whispers. But he hears them. He sees them. Because while the officers ignore him, they have no idea how much he has observed them. He has seen the way Callahan puffs out his chest, barking orders at rookies like a man desperate to prove his worth. He has seen the nervous glances exchanged when the chief walks in, the way even the most arrogant officers suddenly straighten their posture. He has seen the exhaustion in some, the unchecked pride in others, the unspoken fear behind the bravado. David Carter may be just a janitor to them. But in reality, he knows more about this station, and the people in it, than any of them could ever imagine. But David never reacts. He simply nods, smiles faintly, and continues his work. The officers barely notice him, just another faceless worker. But isn't that always the case? People rarely pay attention to the ones who clean up after them. Arrogant, dismissive, and entitled. He sees himself as above everyone else, especially those who don't wear a badge. He enjoys belittling those beneath him, particularly David, whom he sees as an easy target. Reserved yet observant. He carries himself with an air of confidence, even though most dismiss him as just a janitor. He never lets the mockery get to him, though his silence holds more weight than the officers realize. The station is divided. Some officers laugh along with Callahan, either out of shared prejudice or simple peer pressure. Others remain silent, knowing it's wrong but fearing confrontation. After all, who wants to go against the senior officer? David has been working at the station for a few years now, and Callahan has always found amusement in taunting him. But today? Today, Callahan feels particularly emboldened. David moves through the station, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces. He's a shadow, present but unseen. But today, he won't be ignored. "Hey, Carter!" Callahan calls out, his voice carrying across the room. David stops, turns slightly. Callahan leans back in his chair, smirking. "How's it feel, cleaning up after real men?" A few officers chuckle. Some look away, pretending to focus on their paperwork. David doesn't flinch. He simply smiles and continues mopping. Callahan isn't satisfied. He leans forward. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" "Oh, wait, probably too busy dreaming about a life where you actually matter." Another round of uneasy laughter. Some officers exchange glances, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. One younger officer, Officer Daniels, shifts in his seat. "Come on, Mike," he mumbles. But Callahan ignores him. He grins at David. "Hey, tell you what, I'll give you a real job. How about you shine my boots? I mean, let's face it, that's about all you're good for." A silence falls over the room. Even the ones who laughed earlier seem unsure now. David stops mopping. Slowly, he turns and looks Callahan in the eye. His expression remains unreadable. Then, in a calm, measured voice, he says, "You'd be surprised what I'm good for, officer." The response catches Callahan off guard. His grin falters for just a moment, but he quickly recovers. "Oh yeah?" he scoffs. "I doubt that." David simply nods, then returns to his work. The tension lingers in the air. For the first time, Callahan feels something he doesn't recognize: unease. Have you ever underestimated someone, only to regret it later? Just as the uneasy silence settles, the police chief's office phone rings. Chief Reynolds, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, picks up. His expression changes as he listens. He straightens up slightly. "Yes, sir." "Understood." The other officers barely notice, except for Callahan, who smirks. "What's the bet? Some local crying about a parking ticket?" Reynolds doesn't answer. He hangs up the phone, his expression unreadable. Callahan chuckles and turns back to David. "Bet you'd love to have a call like that, huh? Someone important actually giving a damn about you?" David doesn't respond. He just wrings out his mop and moves toward the supply closet. Callahan rolls his eyes. "That's what I thought." But what if Callahan had paid closer attention? What if he had noticed the way Chief Reynolds' jaw had tightened? What if he had realized that the phone call wasn't about some parking ticket, but about someone far more powerful than he could have ever imagined? The air in the station is heavy with an unspoken tension. The officers return to their tasks, but Callahan? He isn't finished. The unease from his earlier exchange with David lingers like a bad aftertaste, and he refuses to let it go. David moves methodically, his mop gliding across the floor, his expression as calm as ever. Callahan watches him, his smirk curling into something meaner. He leans back in his chair, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, I've always wondered," he drawls, stretching his arms behind his head. "What goes through a janitor's mind all day? I mean, it can't be much. Mop left, mop right. Try not to drink the cleaning chemicals." A few nervous chuckles ripple through the room. David doesn't react. He simply wrings out his mop and moves to the next section of the floor. Callahan narrows his eyes, pushing further. "Come on, Carter. Help me out here. You ever do anything real with your life, or has scrubbing toilets always been the dream?" David pauses for just a moment, so brief it's barely noticeable. Then, with the same calm demeanor, he replies, "I take pride in my work, officer." That answer, polite and steady, irritates Callahan more than anything else. He wants a reaction. He wants David to flinch, to fumble, to break. Instead, David just keeps cleaning. "You know," Callahan continues, louder now, "it's funny how people like you always say that. Pride in your work. Makes me wonder if that's just a nice way of saying, I had no other options." Silence. A few officers exchange uneasy glances. Some stare at their paperwork, pretending not to hear. Others shift in their seats. David doesn't look up. "Not everything is about options," he says, voice calm. "Sometimes, it's about responsibility." Callahan scoffs. "Responsibility? Oh, that's rich." He gestures dramatically. "What, keeping the floors nice and shiny? Making sure we don't trip over a coffee stain?" David just smiles. That smile, it unnerves Callahan more than he cares to admit. The unease in the station isn't enough to deter Callahan. He needs to prove his dominance, needs to show everyone that David is exactly what he believes him to be, nothing. And what better way than humiliation? Leaning forward, Callahan claps his hands together. "All right, let's settle something right now," he announces, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "I bet you," he points at Officer Daniels, then at another officer, Ramirez, "and you, that our dear janitor here doesn't even have $20 to his name." A few officers stiffen. David doesn't react. Callahan grins, pressing on. "I mean, let's be real. Guy's pushing what? 50? Probably been working minimum wage his whole life. No way he's got any savings. Ramirez shifts uncomfortably. Come on, Mike, that's what? Callahan interrupts. Just a harmless bet? Come on, lighten up. He laughs, turning back to David. So, Carter, wanna prove me wrong? I'll tell you what, if you've got a 20 in your pocket right now, I'll double it. What do you say? David finally looks up. His expression is unreadable, but his eyes, there's something in them. Something Callahan can't quite place. David reaches into his pocket. For a moment, a flicker of amusement crosses his face, but he says nothing. Instead, he pulls out a single, crumpled bill. A $5 bill. Callahan barks out a laugh. Oh man, that's even worse than I thought. He turns to the others, shaking his head. $5. That's it. You see? This is what happens when you aim low in life. Some officers look away, their discomfort growing. Others chuckle half-heartedly, not wanting to be next on Callahan's list. David tucks the bill back into his pocket and resumes mopping. No anger. No embarrassment. Just patience. And that, more than anything, unsettles Callahan. The mood in the station shifts when the front doors swing open. Chief Reynolds walks in, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. The usual background chatter of the station dies instantly. Something is wrong. The officers instinctively sit up straighter, waiting for the chief to say something. Callahan, however, remains in his seat, still riding the high of his earlier taunt. He grins lazily. What's up, Chief? You lose a parking ticket? Reynolds doesn't answer. He just looks around the room, scanning every face, his gaze unreadable. Then, his eyes land on David. And they stay there. The silence stretches. The tension thickens. David doesn't move. He merely dips his mop back into the bucket and continues cleaning. Callahan snorts, breaking the silence. Man, what is this, a staring contest? He leans back, shaking his head. If this is about some department screw-up, just say the word, Chief. We'll get it sorted. But Reynolds still doesn't answer. Instead, he takes a slow, measured breath. Then, finally, he speaks. Meeting room. Now. A ripple of confusion spreads across the station. Chief? Daniels starts. All of you, Reynolds cuts in, his voice firm. Now. The officers exchange glances. No one argues. One by one, they file into the meeting room, the tension thick enough to choke on. Callahan follows, still smirking, still oblivious. Only David remains outside, wringing out his mop as if nothing unusual is happening. As if this meeting has nothing to do with him. The meeting room is quiet. Too quiet. Reynolds stands at the front, his expression unreadable. The officers sit, waiting. Some shift uncomfortably. Others glance at each other, trying to piece together what's going on. Callahan, as usual, is the first to break the silence. All right, Chief, what's this about? You look like someone just told you your retirement fund vanished. Reynolds doesn't laugh. Instead, he pulls out a file and tosses it onto the table. It lands with a heavy thud. The name on the file? Callahan's smirk wavers. Just slightly. Reynolds exhales. You all need to hear something, he says, his voice low, steady. And when I'm done, you'll understand why. Silence. Callahan leans back, arms crossed. Oh, this should be good. Reynolds doesn't acknowledge him. Instead, he opens the file, flips a few pages, and then, he begins to read. The words that follow will change everything. The weight of the moment hangs in the air like a thick fog. The officers shift uncomfortably in their seats as Chief Reynolds flips through the file in his hands. His voice is steady, deliberate. David Carter isn't just a janitor. Silence. He is the co-owner of this very building. A ripple of disbelief washes over the room. Some officers sit up straighter, others lean forward, brows furrowing. Callahan, however, scoffs. Oh, come on, he mutters. That's gotta be a joke. Reynolds ignores him and continues. David inherited a significant amount of wealth from his father, a respected businessman who invested in infrastructure for law enforcement agencies across the country. But he didn't just sit on it. He expanded it. Through careful investments, business acumen, and philanthropy, David has personally funded multiple law enforcement initiatives, training programs, salary boosts, equipment upgrades, and even housing assistance for officers in need. The disbelief in the room intensifies. You think those new break room renovations last year were city-funded? Reynolds asks, looking around the table. Guess again. The increased pension program? That wasn't just policy changes. That was him. Callahan's mouth opens slightly, but no words come out. David, who has been standing silently in the back of the room, remains calm. His hands are folded in front of him, his face unreadable. Reynolds exhales and places the file on the table. David Carter isn't here because he needs a job, the chief says. He's here because he chooses to be. A thick, suffocating silence follows. No one knows what to say. Some officers exchange uneasy glances, while others stare at David as if seeing him for the first time. Callahan, for the first time in his career, is at a loss for words. His face twitches as he struggles to process what he just heard. The janitor. The man he mocked. Owns the building? Controls the funding? His throat is dry. His usual bravado is nowhere to be found. And then, the question settles in, what would you do if you realized the man you disrespected held the keys to your future? The same realization dawns on the other officers, and some instinctively scoot their chairs away from Callahan. A few shoot him sideways glances, suddenly reassessing their alliances. Callahan swallows hard. His hands tighten into fists under the table. He finally manages a weak chuckle, shaking his head. All right. This is a prank, right? Chief, come on, but Reynolds cuts him off with a sharp look. You think I'd joke about something like this? Callahan shuts his mouth. For the first time since entering the room, David steps forward. His movements are slow, deliberate. He looks directly at Callahan. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just calm, unwavering certainty. You know, David says softly, I've worked a lot of jobs in my life. I've been a laborer. A manager. A business owner. He pauses. And now, a janitor. Callahan's face twitches, but he says nothing. David continues. In all that time, I've learned one thing, respect isn't about a badge. It's about character. The words land heavy in the room. A few officers lower their eyes. Others shift uncomfortably. David tilts his head slightly. You walk around here, acting like your uniform makes you better than everyone else. But let me ask you something, Officer Callahan. Callahan forces himself to meet David's eyes. If a man's worth is measured by his title, David says quietly, then what does that make you right now? A hush falls over the room. The unspoken truth is loud enough for everyone to hear. Callahan isn't looking very high-ranking anymore. Then, Chief Reynolds clears his throat. There's something else, he says. I wasn't going to announce this yet, but given the circumstances. He glances at David, who gives a small nod. Reynolds turns back to the group. David has significant influence over department budgets. That includes salaries, promotions, and personnel restructuring. Callahan's blood runs cold. The reality of the situation slams into Callahan like a freight train. He tries to salvage what's left of his pride. Now hold on, Chief, he says, forcing a laugh. You can't be serious. You're telling me this guy, he jerks his thumb at David, has a say in how we run this department? Reynolds leans forward. You're damn right he does. Callahan's confidence crumbles. Then comes the final blow. Reynolds folds his arms. We've been reviewing personnel for months. Looking at complaints, behavior records, officer evaluations. And Callahan, the chief's voice is firm. You are already on thin ice. Callahan's face turns pale. David watches him, still calm, still composed. I'm not here to punish anyone, he says simply. But actions have consequences. Reynolds nods. Effective immediately, Officer Callahan, you're demoted. A gasp ripples through the room. Callahan's face burns red. Demoted? His voice cracks. You can't do that. I've been on the force for years. Reynolds cuts him off. And in those years, you've made it very clear that you don't value teamwork. Or respect. That ends today. Callahan looks around the room, desperate for support. But his former allies? They're suddenly very interested in their notes, their coffee, anything but him. No one wants to go down with him. Callahan's breaths come fast and shallow. He turns back to David, eyes burning with frustration. You planned this, didn't you? He spits. You were waiting for a reason to pull this stunt. David shakes his head. I didn't have to plan anything, Callahan. A pause. You did this to yourself. Silence. And then, the final humiliation. Reynolds nods toward the door. Get your new assignment from HR. Dismissed. Callahan stares at him, his fists trembling. He looks around one last time, searching for anyone willing to stand with him. No one does. With a choked curse, He pushes away from the table and storms out, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, the room is utterly silent. Then, David simply picks up a mop bucket that had been left near the door. Without a word, he turns and walks back to work. No smugness. No gloating. Just the quiet confidence of a man who never needed validation from anyone. And in that silence, the remaining officers realize something: they just witnessed the most powerful man in the room. Choose humility over arrogance. The door to the chief's office swings open, and Callahan storms back in, his usual arrogance stripped away. His face is flushed, his breathing uneven. The weight of his downfall has finally settled in. "Wait," he says, his voice raw with desperation. The room, still tense from his earlier humiliation, watches as he takes a few shaky steps forward. He looks at David. "Listen, man. I didn't mean any of that. I was just messing around, you know? Just busting chops. You get that, right?" David doesn't respond. Callahan swallows hard and forces a chuckle. "Look, I get it. I screwed up. Big time. But you gotta understand, I've been here for years, man. This is my life. I was just trying to..." "To what?" David interrupts. His voice isn't angry, but firm. "Assert dominance? Make sure everyone knew who was in charge?" Callahan's mouth opens, but nothing comes out. David shakes his head. "You're not sorry for how you treated me. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry there were consequences." Callahan stares at him, his breathing heavy. David holds up a hand, silencing him. "Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." The words hang in the air. Callahan looks around, searching for some kind of support. But the other officers don't meet his gaze. They've already made up their minds. David exhales softly, then turns toward the door. Without another word, he walks away. Callahan takes a step forward. "Wait," the door clicks shut behind David. And just like that, Callahan realizes something terrifying. For the first time in his career, no one is listening to him. The fallout from Callahan's downfall spreads quickly. By the next morning, his new assignment is official: transferred to a lower division, stripped of authority, and put under the command of someone he once outranked. His former allies distance themselves, reluctant to be associated with his behavior. And something unexpected begins to happen. The rest of the station, officers who had once laughed at Callahan's jokes or ignored his bullying, begin to change. Conversations are different now. There's less mockery, fewer dismissive attitudes toward the lower-ranked staff. People start greeting David with genuine respect, not forced, not fearful, but earned. It starts small. A nod of acknowledgement. A casual "Hey, David." A simple thanks when he hands someone a fresh cup of coffee. And soon, it spreads. Veteran officers, rookies, administrative staff, everyone begins to realize. One afternoon, Officer Patel, one of Callahan's former colleagues, stops David in the hallway. "Hey, man," Patel says, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just wanted to say, I never really paid attention before to how Callahan treated you. How we treated you. And, I guess I should have." David studies him for a moment, then nods. "Noticing is the first step," he says. "Doing something about it is the second." Patel nods back, understanding the weight of those words. The station isn't perfect overnight. But the culture shifts. Slowly. Steadily. And it starts with respect. Later that evening, as the station winds down, David finishes mopping the last section of the break room. He wrings out the mop, then leans it against the wall. Chief Reynolds steps into the room, hands in his pockets. He watches David for a moment before speaking. "You know," Reynolds says, "I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years. Seen a lot of people try to prove they're the biggest dog in the yard. Never seen someone take down an ego as big as Callahan's. Just by being himself." David chuckles lightly. "I wasn't trying to take him down." "I know," Reynolds says. "That's what makes it even better." A beat of silence. Then David turns to the chief, his expression calm. "Real power," he says quietly, "is knowing you don't have to prove it." Reynolds exhales through his nose, nodding slowly. "That's a lesson a lot of people could learn." David picks up his mop bucket and heads for the door. He pauses for just a moment. What if respect was the true currency of power? He asks, almost to himself. Then, without another word, he walks away. Reynolds watches him go, a thoughtful look in his eyes. And as the station settles into its newfound order, one thing is clear: respect isn't about rank. It's about character. Months pass, And Callahan's reality has changed drastically. His transfer was more than just a demotion, it was a wake-up call. No more special treatment, no more junior officers eager to impress him. The authority he once flaunted is gone, and in its place, an unfamiliar and bitter truth lingers. Respect wasn't something he had. It was something he forced. And now, without his rank to shield him, the people around him see him for what he really is. At his new division, younger officers don't look up to him. They tolerate him. He tries to assert himself, to regain the control he once had, but it doesn't work. Because power, real power, was never about authority. It was about respect. And he had burned every bridge leading to it. One afternoon, after a long and grueling shift, Callahan sits in his patrol car, staring blankly out the windshield. For the first time in years, he feels truly alone. And he wonders, if he had treated people differently, would his life be different now? Back at the station, David Carter remains exactly as he's always been. He still mops the floors. He still replaces the coffee filters. He still listens more than he speaks. But something is different now. The respect he receives isn't laced with fear or obligation, it's genuine. Officers who once ignored him now greet him warmly. Some even ask for his advice, realizing there's wisdom behind his quiet demeanor. And though David never sought recognition, his presence leaves a lasting mark. He doesn't use his influence to punish or seek revenge. He uses it to make sure the department improves, to ensure fairness, integrity, and respect become the foundation of its culture. One evening, as he prepares to leave, a young officer stops him. "Hey, David," she says. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything. You changed this place." David smiles, shaking his head. "I didn't change anything," he says simply. "I just reminded people of what was always supposed to matter." He gives a small nod and walks away, leaving behind a station that, because of him, will never be the same again.